Okay, so last time we were talking about classical sculpture, and particularly we were talking about three of the great sculptors who kind of changed how things were done in the classical period, basically, right? So Praxiteles, Scopas, and Lysippus. So now we're going to look at something else that was fairly influential in this time period, and it's actually a who, not a something. It's Alexander the Great. So we've talked about him a little bit before. Originally he's from Macedonia, right? And then he takes over all of Greece and expands the Greek Empire very, very far, all the way to India, right? So his court, so the Macedonian court of Alexander the Great was very wealthy. And what I mean by court is not like a judicial court, but that's kind of like what you call society life around a royal, essentially, and everything that kind of goes into the inner workings of their palace or wherever they are headquartered. So the Macedonian court of Alexander the Great is very wealthy, obviously, because he's conquered a lot of the world, right? So he has many artists in his employ at his court, and they are paid to create art specifically for him and his empire. So let's look at some of the unique things that happen there. So one of the things that we see are Pella mosaics, okay? So Pella mosaics are made out of pebbles rather than tile. So we're going to talk about the technique of mosaic in this class several different times in different contexts. Mosaic is a technique where you're making an image, a mostly flat two-dimensional image, usually on a floor, ceiling, or wall. And it's composed out of little tiny pieces that are put together to make one big image. When we get to the Byzantine and when we get into Rome, it's mostly done with little bitty pieces of tile called tessera. In this case, the Pella mosaics of Alexander the Great's court are made with pebbles. So to get all the color variation and everything just right on this fairly complicated image, they had to find all these pebbles that were in the right color, so pebbles being little rocks, right, and arrange them just so that they could create this kind of image. This particular one, the stag hunt, is one of the earliest mosaic signatures, artist signatures known, and we know that the person who made it was named Gnosis because it says Gnosis made it on the mosaic, which is kind of cool. So it's a very, very early artist signature. This particular kind of imagery is called skiagraphia. That's Skiagraphia, and it means shadow painting. Now, this isn't literally a painting, but this particular kind of technique is when a lot of attention is paid to the value, the lightness or darkness on forms to make two-dimensional depictions look like three-dimensional forms. So if you look in this image at all the careful little shadows in the anatomy and like the musculature on the torso, under the jawline, around the forehead and the eyes, to make this look more three-dimensional, that is called skiagraphia. Okay, so we also have a very famous mosaic from this period that is of the Battle of Issus. So this was a very important battle for Alexander the Great, and it was Issus, ISSUS, was in Persia, and this is the decisive battle when Alexander the Great is trying to conquer the Persians on their home turf, and it's between Alexander and Darius III. So Darius III is the Persian king at this time, and we have Alexander the Great riding into battle against him. He is riding his horse, Bucephalus, who is kind of a famous horse. Okay, so he's depicted here as well. And this mosaic is actually a copy of a painting, and I mention that because it's one of the only recordings where we know that it was a female artist who made the original painting in the ancient world. So in the ancient world, we don't have that many artist signatures, and we particularly don't have many from women artists. So when there's one that exists, I like to point it out because it's kind of neat. So this is by Helena of Egypt, And we know it was by Helena of Egypt because Pliny the Elder writes about it, and also because in the encyclopedic work Bibliotheca by Photius I, who was a patriarch of Constantinople, we see her name appear in a list of significant women from history named Helena, and it says, and Helen, the female painter, also belongs to the list. She was the daughter of her father, was also a painter in Egypt, and it specifically lists that she painted the Battle of Isis. So that's just kind of a neat thing that exists. And this is in that same Pella mosaic technique where we have these individual pebbles being pieced together to create a greater picture. And notice the attention to the light and shadow, the skiagraphia, to show the three-dimensional aspect of the figures and the horses. Okay, so in architecture, some exciting things happen. So you may remember Polykleitos. Polykleitos was the sculptor who wrote canon and set out the the ideal ratios for the human form in sculpture. This is his son, Polykleitos the Younger, and he is the first recorded architect to create this kind of structure, which is a theater. Theater comes from the word theatron, which means scene place. And theatron specifically referred to where you would sit in the theater, so this kind of stadium seating, and that's where we get the name theater from. And then in the middle, down at the bottom, where the performance would happen, that was called the orchestra, and that's literally means the dancing place. So if you go to the theater today, the orchestra, or the pit, is where the musicians play, and then the actors and whoever are on the stage. So that word originates from this idea that that's where the performance took place, and so it's from the word for the dancing place. This is a pretty cool invention. It's very popular in Greece, and then we see some Roman adaptations of it, including the amphitheater, which we'll talk about when we talk about the Roman Empire. This is made out of concrete, and concrete is structurally important to this kind of being able to create this kind of massive structure and have it be stable. It's also built into a hillside, so we see lots of these being developed. Another thing that happens around this time period, right before we get into the Hellenistic period, is a new order in architecture becomes popular. So we have Doric, we have Ionic, we've talked about those quite a lot, going all the way back to the Archaic, and now we have Corinthian. So Corinthian, if you were to identify it, you would look at this, like this is the capital of the columns, and you'll notice we have the volute, the twirly things like we have in the Ionic order, but we also now have some foliage. We have some leaves in here. So it's a little bit more decorated. It's a little bit fancier, and so we call that a Corinthian column. Okay. Next, we'll talk about the Hellenistic period.